Hi, welcome back to the channel. I got a recent comment from another viewer that reminded me I haven't done a Was the Book Better in a while. And he was talking about the Red Sonja movie, and I realized, oh, I haven't seen that movie in a while either. So today we're going to talk about Red Sonja and how I guess really the character has sort of changed and evolved, and not so much as like just a compare and contrast of a book versus a movie because the character's a little more complicated than that. She's a very famous character. A lot of people kind of are familiar with her, even if they don't know much about her. She's the warrior woman with the bright red hair and the chainmail bikini. That's the two things that are probably the most stand out the most for people. Chainmail bikini has become rather controversial over the years. Some feminists don't like it. Some feminists do love it. You know, whatever. If you type in Red Sonja cosplay, you'll see some really fit women who look really good in that chainmail bikini. Go to any Renaissance festival, guaranteed there's going to be someone wearing that. Um, but yeah, let's talk a little about the character. She is usually described as a Robert E. Howard character, which is kind of half true. Uh, she was a character in a Robert E. Howard story. The name was spelled different. It was Red Sonja with a Y instead of a J. I think she still had red hair, but the story took place in like 16th century, and there's gunfights and that sort of thing, and it's just really a one-off character. I don't think she ever appears in anything else. I think someone said that she is mentioned in a Conan story called Red Nails. I haven't read that in a while, and I honestly don't remember. Um, but the so she's really not the way we think of Red Sonja today is not how Robert E. Howard depicted her. So where did this come from? And it came from Marvel Comics. You see, back in the early 70s, very early 70s, Marvel Comics wasn't doing really well. And I remember seeing this in an interview with Stan Lee. He was talking about the history of Marvel Comics. And they started making Conan the Barbarian comic books. I believe because uh, at that time the character was in the public domain. He's still well, the stories are in the public domain now. The character in the world is actually owned by someone now, and that gets licensed out to places like Marvel Comics. And so they start making comics about Conan the Barbarian, but they weren't really making comics. What they were doing is they were making these magazines. If you look at the Savage Sword of Conan, they're bigger. They're not like your comic size. And because they weren't really comic books, they weren't labeled as comic books, they're labeled as magazines, they could get around the censors at the time. There was starting back I think in the late 40s, early 50s, there was a group that had to approve all comic books. It was a governmental group that read all the comic books, and they said this one is good and this one isn't bad, or this one isn't good and this one can be okay. And we get this little seal of approval. If you look at some of the old comics, they'd have like this little seal of approval up there, meaning it was approved by kind of the government to produce these things. But their mandate only covered comic books. So when you had these larger magazines, they didn't have to go past the censors, which meant they could kind of do whatever they wanted. And that's what they started doing with the Conan the Barbarian stories. A lot of sword fighting, a lot of blood, barely clothed or not clothed at all women, big scary monsters, and people loved it. They ate it up. This was also coming out at about the time that there was the sort of resurgence of sword and sorcery again. Robert E. Howard invented the genre. A few other people wrote in it, but back in the late '60s and certainly by the '70s and the '80s, it was huge. It was really popular. A lot of the old Robert E. Howard stories got re-released. The covers of the books had these amazing things from Vallejo and Franzetta. I remember my dad having some of those and just being in awe at the art. I had no idea what I was looking at. I was like 6 or 7 years old. Um, and then all these other people start making pastiches and start making their own stuff. This is when Lynn Carter and Sprague de Camp and however you say his name, Robert Jordan started putting out new books and that sort of thing. And in all of that, and this was before the Conan the Barbarian movie came out. The reason why that movie was made was because Conan was already popular. Arnold Schwarzenegger did not make Conan popular. He kind of like broke through to the mainstream to everybody else, but that character in that world was already taking off in literature and in the comic books. And I think in the interview that I saw with Stan Lee, he even said that for a little while, Conan the Barbarian was keeping the lights on at Marvel Comics. That was the character that was selling and was making money, outselling Spider-Man. This was before the New Avengers, or not the New Avengers, the new X-Men with Wolverine and Storm and all those stuff. So they were kind of floundering for characters. And so when they saw how popular Conan was, they started doing a deep dive to see what else they could pull out. And a couple of the writers there discovered this character named Red Sonja. And so they basically just took that idea, which is really just a name and red hair at the time, and then built the character that we know as Red Sonja today with the chainmail bikini and all that. They put the character in the Hyborian age so she could kind of interact with Conan and be in that familiar world, and they were just hoping it'd be like a nice spin-off that could kind of keep bolstering the sales. My guess is they probably did a few other things. I know they did Cull the Conqueror magazine, because I have some of those, but I don't know if they did like comics of Cull. They might have, but that sort of sword and sorcery world, Hyborian age kind of thing really took off, and they kind of went with it. But of the two characters that really lasted was, of course, Conan and Red Sonja. The story that they came up with was that she was a Hyrcanian, which again has nothing to do with Robert E. Howard, because in his stories, Hyrcanians are sort of like the Mongols. Well, she's got bright red hair and white skin and all that sort of stuff. But they went with it anyway. And her family was killed by raiders. Family farm was burned. She was raped by the raiders, because back in the 70s that was a thing. Try and do that today. And then this goddess comes to her and says, I will give you the power to avenge, yourself and others, but you can't have sex with any men that haven't defeated you in battle. And of course, then she's like really badass in battle, and so she basically just never had sex. So she's kind of like a warrior nun sort of thing. I don't remember where the chainmail bikini thing came in. I think it was more of like, this looks cool, so we're going to go with it, and that's where that kind of came from. So she started off as a Robert E. Howard story. Then she became a comic book, stayed a comic book for a long time. She did also become a novelization. I do have one of these in my offices. They made a series of Red Sonja books. I think that's book 1 of 6, which are just sort of like Conan comics, except they're Red Sonja. That's really about it. They're just sword and sorcery stories. They just happen to, involve Red Sonja. And so that went on for a very long time. And then in the mid-1980s, they decided to make a Red Sonja movie. This movie was after Conan the Barbarian and Conan the Destroyer. And by this point, sword and sorcery movies were everywhere. If you really like sword and sorcery movies, I would suggest using a Tubi or Tubi, not sure how you pronounce it, but it's Tubi. They're a streaming service. They're free. And this is not like promoted or anything. I just want you to be able to see these movies. But they have ads, but they have a lot of sword and sorcery stuff. They have a lot of this old stuff from the 80s, like Sorceress, The Warrior and the Sorceress, The Amazons, Deathstalker 2. And they have like some newer movies that kind of fall in that genre as well. But yeah, sword and sorcery movies were crazy. They were everywhere. And so they decided to make a Red Sonja movie. There was a few things why it fell short. See, I hadn't seen the movie in a long time until like this past weekend, because when I first saw it, I remember not liking it. And a lot of people fall into that camp. They either love it or they hate it. And after I rewatched it, I realized why I think a lot of people don't like the movie. There's really nothing inherently wrong with the movie. But I think one mistake that they made was they put Arnold Schwarzenegger in it. See, this was Bridget Nielsen's first movie. She plays Red Sonja. She had never, I don't think she'd ever acted anything. She was just a model. But she's really tall. She's about as tall as Arnold Schwarzenegger, and he's 6'2". So she's really tall. Not particularly muscular, but this was in the mid 80s. Most women weren't really working out. There weren't a lot of fitness models in the 80s, if you will. And I think the studio was worried that she would be bankable. So they wanted to put someone in the movie that they knew people would show up to go see, and so they stuck in Arnold Schwarzenegger. The problem is Arnold Schwarzenegger played Conan. That's one of his iconic roles. And they even kind of dressed him up a little bit like Conan. Still had the long hair. Of course, he's got the accent because he can't get rid of that. And he kind of even acts a little bit like Conan and that sort of stuff. And so seeing him on the screen immediately makes you think of Conan the Barbarian movie, and you start comparing those two, and it's really kind of an unfair comparison. They're different movies made, with different characters, kind of telling a different story. With the Conan the Barbarian movie, it was, I call it like the Star Wars of fantasy movies, because it really did change fantasy movies from that point on. It blew people's minds. But I think also, to me, it just always looked real. It's kind of like The Lord of the Rings, using a more modern comparison. Modern, like 20 years ago. But when I saw the Shire in The Lord of the Rings, I believe that was like a real place. I knew it wasn't, but it looked so real. It had all the detail. The Shire, Rohan, Minas Tirith, those looked like real places because they did such a good job of designing the sets and putting all the details and the people and the costumes, that sort of thing. And they did the same thing with Conan the Barbarian. I believe Thulsa Doom's temple at the end actually existed somewhere, and the costumes and all this other stuff. It looked great. It looked amazing. It's not really true with Red Sonja. The costumes are a little flashy. The swords look like props. And even the sets look like sets, The problem is also, whereas Conan the Barbarian was kind of allowed to be its own thing, if you look at Red Sonja, one of the first things it says is, a Dino De Laurentiis production. And that was what clued me into, like, another problem with this movie, was that by the time Red Sonja had come out, we had, if I get in chronological order, we'd had Flash Gordon, Conan the Barbarian, Conan the Destroyer, and Dune. And if you're as familiar with those movies as I am, when you watch Red Sonja, you see all the influences. Some of the costumes look very Flash Gordon-like, a lot more elaborate and a lot more sort of costumey. They don't look like clothes that people wore. They look like a costume you wear on a movie set. The Evil Queen's throne room looks a lot like Ming the Merciless's throne room in Flash Gordon. The guy who played Raban in Dune is in this movie. Just all this sort of other things they kind of put into it. They put a little kid who's just like annoying. I'm not even sure why he's in there. You don't have to have a kid doing it, but they decided to. And he's annoying, and he's supposed to be annoying, but he's annoying. And it kind of pulls from the rest of the movie. And so, really, the movie itself suffers from all of that because I think the studio just didn't really believe in the movie, so they kept kind of putting other stuff in there, thinking, well, this is going to prop it up and that sort of thing. Is the movie a bad movie? Well, it's not a great movie. It's certainly no Conan the Barbarian. It is not a horribly bad movie. I think it's really interesting because it's still one of the few sword and sorcery movies of that time in which there's a heroine. There's a woman in there. Most of them were trying to be rip-offs of Conan the Barbarian, which means you have a male lead, usually big and muscular, and he's doing all the fighting, and the woman is the damsel in distress. In this movie, it worked out that Red Sonja was the heroine. Um, and I kind of find it be unfortunate that they stuck Arnold Schwarzenegger in there because I think that character was strong enough that she could have carried the movie all on her own. Um, and so, how the character compares to the other movies or to the comics and that sort of thing. Well, the storyline is basically the same. They start off with the introduction of her being killed and raped, except in this case, it was an evil queen that wanted her for her own, kind of lesbian sort of thing, and she was repelled by that, and she attacked the queen, and the queen got mad, and so she had everyone killed and had her, raped by her soldiers and stuff like that. And then the goddess her shows up and gives her power, but doesn't really go much in the detail beyond that. I kind of felt like they could have ran with that storyline, but they just sort of like threw it in there just to keep the comic book readers happy. Um, there's no chainmail bikini. Red Sonja has red hair, but it's quite clearly a wig, and it's like the most epic of all mullets. Really, it's business in the front and party in the back, all the way in the back, that sort of thing. Um, but what's cool is unlike a lot of the other sword and sorcery stories there wasn't any gratuitous nudity. I don't think there's any nudity at all. Now that I think about it, um, it was sexualized, but was in that sort of predatory where the guys were always wanting to get with Red Sonja, and she's fighting him off because she's not going to go down that road. Um, so it holds true to the stories, in that sense. It's a little more high fantasy than Sword and Sorcery. I think that's another reason why a lot of people don't like it compared to Conan the Barbarian, whereas that was like strict Sword and Sorcery. Um, and and by the way, the character's still going on today. You can still buy comic books. They're put out by Dynamite Comics instead of Marvel Comics. Marvel sold them along the way. For a while, the comics were really good, and there were sort of like standard, Red Sonja sort of stories. And then there was now I blanked our name, Simone something. Can't remember her name. She changed it up. She wanted to deconstruct the character because that's what social justice warriors do nowadays. They don't create new things; they just deconstruct the old ones. I have a love-hate relationship with that too, and what she did was she made it to where it was all just a big lie. That there was no goddess, there was no power, her, vow of like chastity, semi-chastity, was totally pointless, that sort of thing. And what Dynamite did during that period was they made Red Sonja just a female version of Conan. She drank a lot, she cussed a lot, she slept with whoever she wanted. She was kind of a mercenary, and I think that was sort of this sort of thing of like, well, we want women to have a Conan character as well. Well, you might as well just read Conan, that sort of thing. Do something to make the character stand out, make her different, make her special. Some of the stories were really good. I did really like them, and it did show that, Red Sonja had a little more depth to her. But in general, that was sort of like the beginning of the end. The last comics of hers that I read, they sort of devolved into like soap opera type stuff. I mean, pages and pages, panels and panels of her talking to someone, pining over some guy or something. I'm like, this is not Red Sonja. I think a lot of comic book writers think that all women like are soap operas. And so when they want like, hey, let's make this more appealing to women, they immediately make it about, dating, chasing after some man, who likes who, just pages and pages of dialogue. Maybe it's also because the art is cheaper. There's no big dynamic fight scenes or anything else like that. I don't know what it is, but Red Sonja, in my mind, hasn't really been worth reading for many years now, and I just kind of stopped collecting the comics. But movie character, I would say watch the movie. It's fun. It's not a life-changing event, but it's still a fun movie. Get to see sort of what 80s, sword and sorcery were like. As far as the books go, if you like sword and sorcery books, pick them up. If you can find them, I had to buy all mine on eBay. They're way out of print. They're printed in the early 80s, back as like all this sword and sorcery stuff was really taking off. But yeah, they're kind of fun, but they're really nothing, amazing or spectacular. The old comic books are a lot more interesting. If you can read some of the earlier um, uh, Dynamite comics, those are good. Um, and then, yeah, if you can really stretch back and find some of the old Marvel comics as well, they're probably online. I don't know if Marvel's ever actually reprinted them in like an omnibus or anything else like that. But anyway, tell me what you think. Have you seen the movie? Did you like it? Do you hate it? Um, if you did like it, what did you like about it? If you didn't like it, what was that? Are you a Red Sonja fan in general, regardless of the movies or any of the other stuff? She's still a very interesting character, and I kind of wish someone would buy her up from Dynamite so they could do it right. But Dynamite Comics doesn't really have a lot going for them right now, so Red Sonja is kind of like their tentpole character, and they're kind of screwing her up. But yeah, let me know what you think. Also, if you have other ideas for was the book better kind of videos, and post those down below too, because I'm always looking for new ideas. I got a bunch of movies at home that I'm kind of meaning to get through, but with my own writing and that sort of stuff. Also, just a little plug. One of my stories, speaking of female heroines, a new character in a new world that I've created called Naja the Witch Warrior. A story appeared in Sexy Fantastic #4. I'll put a link down in the description so you can find it, so you can get it. But it's called A Babe in the Woods. And so, yeah, if you like Red Sonja type characters, you might want to check out, Naja the Witch Warrior. I'm still writing more stories in that world too, so stay tuned. There'll be more things coming out. But anyway, I will talk to you later. Bye.